Hello. Hello and welcome. I'm Bart Watson, your president and CEO here at the Brewers Association. For the next, thank you. For the next half hour or so, I'm going to step back into my old role as chief economist to give you an overview of what's going on in the world and in our community. By the end, we'll see if you question my sanity for taking the CEO role. I want to start with some thank yous. First, thank you to all of you in the room, our members, our sponsors, what we do here at CBC, but more broadly, everything we do in our association wouldn't be possible without all of you, so thanks. Also, thank you for being here with us in Indy. We know that for many of you, money is tighter than ever, so we put a lot of work into trying to make sure that coming to this conference is one of the best 2 investments you make all year along with your BA member dues. Special thanks goes out to anyone who filled out the annual production survey. Forms the foundation of a lot of what we're going to talk about today. And on that note, I also want to thank our not-so-new-anymore staff economist, Matt Gasiak, who did almost all of the data work this year. So anytime there's an insightful graph or statistic or analysis in this presentation, that's likely thanks to Matt. All right, let's move into the data and analysis. My primary goal today is to give you as much context as possible to understand your business in the craft industry. To do that, I'm going to use a thematic setup that I've seen from a number of analysts recently, comparing short-term transitory headwinds, things that might pass, from longer-term structural factors. One of the most common questions we're getting on our analysis team at the Brewers Association right now is some version of, when are we going to get through this? Well, what if this is it? I.e., this is simply the environment facing craft brewers for the foreseeable future. Should brewers be peering into murky crystal balls looking for brighter days ahead, or should they be hunkering down and accepting this current reality? To help you forecast your business, we're going to break apart and outline some of what we see as short-term transitory factors that might clear, and what are long-term structural factors, and how each is shifting consumer demand. So when those short-term transitory headwinds pass, what will that long-term landscape be like? Will it be one of growth? What does that demand environment look like? Is it going to be better, or are we looking at the same challenging environment? Let's start with where we are. Last year, the Brewers Association measured craft brewer beer volume down 4%. That's the weakest performance outside of COVID that we've ever measured. We've been measuring since the early 1980s. It's not all bad news, and it's worth noting that even in a declining environment, there are plenty of growth stories. I mentioned this yesterday in my welcome address. We measured 43% of breweries growing last year in our data. However, a declining industry limits the breadth of that growth opportunity, as well as how much one brewery's success draws on another brewery's volume. So while the overall growth number isn't necessarily determinative of your company's success, minus 4% doesn't mean you can't grow, it does set the overall balance of growth versus failure. The picture is slightly better when we consider brewing companies more holistically. We think about them as total beverage companies. On our survey, we ask about Beyond Beer products, and companies that produce Beyond Beer, the median growth, it was growth for those companies, was plus 1.1%. That's versus a median decline for all companies of minus 6.5%. In addition, another positive note, 52%, a majority of companies who produce Beyond Beer saw growth last year. That's nearly a 10 percentage point increase from the stat I just gave you, that 43% of companies overall saw growth. So companies that are diversifying are seeing stronger trends. Now, we don't know if that's translating into profits or requires further investment, but that's certainly a positive sign that many of you are finding new innovative ways to grow. Looking solely at the beer craft breweries produce, a lot of this boils down to consumer demand. And we can take that consumer demand and we can break it down to a simple equation. How many craft drinkers are there? How much they drink? And what percentage of their drinking occasions are they dedicating to craft? We're going to look at each of those in turn to fully understand where craft is going. Starting with the first one, this may be surprising to learn, but this is the most positive. The number of craft drinkers continues to grow. Here's some Scarborough data that we've been gathering year over year or every couple of years. And last year, it measured the highest percentage of legal drinking age adults who drank craft in the last 30 days. 9.8%, that's up from 9.1% the year before, 8.4% in 2019, and only 6.6% way back in 2013. You can measure the number of craft drinkers in different ways, but we've found similar increases using different frequency measures in our own Harris Poll data. All right, next up is how much they drink. We'll cover total drinking levels later when we get to long-term structural factors, but if there are short-term declines, they're much smaller than I think some of the media reports would suggest. While there's certainly year-over-year variation driven by economic factors, I think we saw some of that in Q1 this year, which won't be covered in this presentation, but many of you probably felt. Total per capita, though, however, total per capita beverage alcohol consumption over the past decades is really a story of continuity, not one of decline. Whether that will hold, we'll talk about more. All right, that leaves variable number 3. And if variable number 1 is up, variable number 2 is flat to slightly down, and craft is losing volume, it stands to reason that craft is losing occasions. We don't have a direct measure of this, but probably the closest we can get is a question that we ask every year on our annual consumer survey, where we ask people, are you drinking more, less, or the same amount of craft beer? Go back to 2015, and people were really leaning into the category. It was 44% more versus 11% less. Fast forward to 2020, and it was still positive, 29% more versus 20% less. Well, in 2024, those flipped, and we saw it was only 25% more versus 26% less. So even if there are more craft drinkers, and total they're drinking about the same amount, what's happening is, in general, they're leaning slightly out of the category. Why? Why are they not drinking more craft? The number one reason they're not drinking craft continues to be that they're drinking more of something else. Simply put, regular craft drinkers are shifting their drinking to other parts of beverage alcohol. This is a look at just craft drinkers, and we're looking at over a 5-year period, and we're looking at the weekly consumption in various categories. And what this shows is that craft drinkers, or core consumers, have increased their weekly drinking in every other part of beverage alcohol over the last 5 years, whereas craft, it's remained flat. And unless you're making real ale, flat is not good. Perhaps this is one reason that breweries that are diversifying are seeing stronger trends. They're simply making what their customers are already drinking. So why? Why are craft drinkers shifting their occasion? Other data suggests that consumers are now seeking flavor profiles more than specific products. We see this as an opportunity for brewers to educate or re-educate consumers who might only connect craft beer with IPAs or particular styles. If non-core craft drinkers are seeking out fruity or tart or juicy flavor profiles, beer can do that too, but we need to tell that story to the consumer. I'm going to close here on a more optimistic note as we close the presentation. All right, so what else is driving these consumption shifts? How much of it might clear or even turn positive in a year or two, and how much of it is likely here to stay no matter the state of the economy or whatever's going on in the news cycle? Let's start with those short-term challenges. The short-term factors are likely ones that you're hearing about on the news or reading about on a weekly or daily basis. There's really 2 buckets here. Some are economic, relate to consumer sentiment, pricing, inflation, et cetera. And some are still related to the ripples from COVID and consumer behavior. Those aren't the tidal waves of a few years ago where we saw everybody rush out to the grocery stores and then rush back, maybe not as strong, to the bars. But they're still affecting consumer behavior as they ebb. Starting with economic, the largest economic factors likely relate to the consumer. This is again one that I'm not going to cover 2025, but I think we saw in Q1 2025 as the consumer was worried about what was going on in the fluctuations in the economy. The most important likely relate to consumer purchasing power and sentiment. How much money do people have, and how willing are they to spend it on beverage alcohol, and in particular, to spend it on craft? There's no one single measure that you can say, okay, this is how people are feeling or what their purchasing power is, but this is the one I think comes closest. This is real employment cost index. So what this is a measure that controls for inflation, so the prices that are out there, for people's wages, and for the composition of jobs in the economy. What it shows is a slight decline since 2020. The average worker, depending on their job, has a little bit less kind of real money in, but it shows growth in 2023 and 2024. Add to that a job market that added nearly 2 million jobs in the past year, and it actually leaves you scratching your head as to why short-term economic factors aren't considered a positive rather than a negative. Well, that relates to consumer sentiment. And a lot has been written about this, about why maybe the data's good, but people aren't necessarily feeling good. My favorite framing of this is the so-called vibe session. The data may be good, but the vibes are off. A lot of this relates to inflation. People don't like inflation, and I think the most pertinent research point is that when people see their own wages go up, they tend to attribute that to their own factors. They like that, they can control that. But when prices go up more broadly in the economy, that's somebody else's fault, most likely the government, and they don't like that because that's out of their control, and that makes them want to hunker down in their spending. With all of this, it's worth remembering that your customer is not the same as the craft customer, is not the same as the general American consumer. So you really have to be focused in on what's going on with your customers. For craft customers in general, they're likely to be higher education, higher socioeconomic status, higher income, and so they may be better able to weather some of these short-term turbulence that we are seeing in the economy right now. At the same time, even if they are able to do that, even if they have a little bit more money and they're a little bit more willing to continue spending, one thing we've clearly seen in our data is that the craft customer's price elasticity has gone up in recent years. In simple terms, that means they're just more sensitive to price and to price increases. Some of that may be economic. Again, we've seen that real wages have dropped a little bit. But I think a lot more of it is related to lower adherence to the category, those omnibulous craft drinkers that I just showed you, as well as competition. When you see more options as ready alternatives, when you have customers who are thinking in flavor categories rather than product categories, suddenly the range of options that you're willing to consider goes up. And so those price differences between not just craft brands, but the overall category matter more and are going to make people more willing to switch. Tariffs have the potential to create more ripples, both internally for our industry and for the economy and your customers. I think that's part of the story of what we saw in Q1. At this point, it's unclear how that would significantly affect craft demand. I think there's some pros and there's some minuses. Your prices are another story. Certainly, there's more challenges there. So tariffs will be a short-term wild card. There may actually be some competitive benefits to craft if imports are paying significant tariffs. We have a lot of imported beer in our industry, and wine and spirits are much more import-heavy than even beer. But it's hard to see how a short-term inflationary spike that reduces consumer purchasing power and raises your cost of goods, as many of you are exposed to international points in the supply chain, is anything but a negative in the short term. Rest assured that this is one place that the Brewers Association is engaged in telling your story. I can now readily tell you the flight times from Denver to Washington, D.C., as well as the closest tap rooms to the Capitol. When you're up there a lot, you need a beer. A more medium-term shift in between the short-term transitory and the long-term structural involves distribution and retail. Distributor consolidation and SKU rationalization from both distributors and retailers means less support and access for craft brewers on those stops. Some of this is likely the result of excess inventories and oversupply coming out of the pandemic. But some of it's shifts in business models or competitive strategy that's driving simplification in beer as distributors move into new categories, such as the trend of distributors picking up more ready-to-drink cocktails and even full-strength spirits, or new competitors altogether at both distribution and retail, aforementioned canned cocktails, but also hemp-derived THC beverages. These shifts are going to exacerbate the market frictions that have always existed between small brands and much bigger distribution and retail channels. This is another place that the Brewers Association is going to continue to be heavily engaged and will continue fighting for you around market access. All right, moving off those short-term and then medium-term and moving toward longer-term structural trends, we find a litany of challenges, but also some opportunities. We think most of the challenges are variants of the meta question around how much are people going to drink going forward. In our earlier equation, I suggested that the evidence for short-term declines is probably not as strong as the media reports. But when you break out what might be affecting drinking and look at all of the component parts, when all of those are potentially negative, you have to wonder how much that short-term volume can hold in the long term. Let's dig in there. I don't think there's any one factor anyone can point to and say, this is clearly what is pulling down beverage alcohol. However, many of the parts form an interrelated web. Is it lifestyle changes? Your smartphone and your couch is a primary competitor to bars, or shifts in spending patterns brought on by new things like online sports gambling. Is it a broad category of health and wellness, which we could probably subdivide into public policy, public health, and even new things like GLP-1 drugs? Is it new competition from cannabis or hemp-derived beverages more specifically? Or is it demographics, which affect all of these shifting preferences, but also change who the drinker is? We have a new, much more diverse generation coming in, and female drinkers are increasingly driving beverage alcohol consumption, albeit at different places and different levels. All of these are going to be intertwined and tied as we see a generation of baby boomers largely exit beverage alcohol as consumers, and the next generation step in much more tied to these shifts. If there's good news, it's that the evidence for each of these is not as strong as the media narrative. Yes, we can decompose each, and we can perhaps find small effects, but these aren't often the dramatic changes no one is drinking that you read about in the headlines. More broadly, yes, 21 to 24-year-olds are spending a lower percentage of their income on beverage alcohol than previous generations. That's one we're tracking. We're going to be providing you more data on that. But this has been going on in the data for at least a decade, and when you follow the first cohorts that showed up and dropped their spending, as they moved into 25 to 34, that spending came back up to more historic levels. So that suggests this may be more something where we see a dip and then a reversion to a mean, more than a long-term dip in stasis. More optimism in the long term can perhaps be seen in the demand drivers for beverage alcohol. The top 3 reasons that people say they buy craft are flavor, variety, and then some value component. On the value proposition, I think the signs there for craft brewers are somewhat mixed. The next generation clearly still connects with local, but is much more of a show-me generation. They want to know why local is good. So they're going to want to support products that align with their values, and I think a lot of small and independent businesses are going to naturally be there, but you're going to have to work harder to show them what you're doing and tell them that story. In general, beverage alcohol also continues to be driven toward flavor and variety. I think this is probably a primary reason that there are more drinkers considering craft, as we saw. At the same time, there's more competition. So you're going to have to work harder within a sea of flavor and variety to get people to consider your products. Given that this has been true for decades, you've always had to compete, I think maybe the real insight here is that the pace of change has picked up, and so that need to be telling your story, to be innovating, to changing is going to increase over time. Whew, so we've covered a lot already. Let's recap. Craft may be growing consumers, good news, but it's still losing volume, primarily because it's losing occasions. Some of that might be short-term. I think that's some of what we're seeing this year related to inflation and pricing, but much more of it is likely related to competition and that sea of options that consumers have to view out there. In the background for all of this, competing for dollars, competing for attention, is a web of long-term factors that pose threats to overall beverage alcohol consumption. And all of these challenges get exacerbated by distribution and retail, which supports categories on the way up, as we saw with craft, and then leans out as they're on the way down. I wish I could provide more clarity, give you a 5-year forecast on where craft is going and when we're going to be out of this. But I think one thing we can do is arm you with knowledge in an effort to help every brewery face the current realities. So what's your strategy if this is it? The BA will have your back in that process, both through the insights that keep you informed, presentations like today, and our larger efforts to improve the overall environment. We aren't going to take those long-term threats as a given, but in collaboration with partners across beverage alcohol, are going to engage, tell your story, and push back. We'll also continue to arm you with the insights, market analysis, data that you need to form your small business strategy. So when you form that small business strategy, you're doing it with large company resources. All right, this takes us through the first portion of the talk, transitory headwinds, long-term structural factors. Next up, we're going to dive deeper into specific craft business models, look at craft by size, before closing a little bit more optimistically around ways we can still win in this environment. We're going to go through one by one of each of the kind of business models we track, starting with regionals. Regionals slightly beat the category, -3%. It's a Pyrrhic victory, perhaps. I'm not breaking out contracts specifically in this presentation, but contracts were also -3%, and I think I would say very similar things to them, what I'm going to say about regionals. In contrast to last year, regional performance wasn't necessarily driven by the top, so actually looks a little bit stronger if you remove the top few companies from this category. It was a little more broad-based. And in general, in talking to regionals and looking through the data, my sense is regionals are growing for two reasons. One, as we already talked about, distributors and retailers are leaning in on larger, more familiar brands as they have that SKU consolidation. And second, I think a lot of regional brewing companies have put in the hard work in recent years to rationalize their brand portfolios, to rationalize their geographic footprint, and that's now paying dividends. That doesn't mean that all regionals are out of the woods or that all regionals were successful, and I think this is going to be a space where we're going to see further consolidation in the coming years as you look to see regionals who still have strong brands match that with excess capacity. Next up, and in contrast, are microbreweries, who had the weakest category performance at -7%. Microbreweries are production and distribution-focused breweries under 15,000 barrels. The microbrewery story is really a flip of the regional one. If you've got distributors and retailers focusing on fewer brands and leaning in on those, there are going to be winners and losers, and the tyranny of space means that something has to go. In a world of physical constraint, craft beer can't be digital music that supports as long a tail as consumers will buy from or the algorithms will show you. So if you're in distribution, you need to constantly be thinking about how you're going to remain relevant to your customers, to your distributors are your customers, and your retailers, or risk being cut and part of that long tail that's getting cut from shelves and from distributor trucks. This is another place, another reason that the Brewers Association will continue to be engaged on market access. So if you can't earn traditional distribution, you have the right for self-distribution or new forms like direct-to-consumer. All right, up next are the hospitality-focused breweries. Tap rooms match the overall category performance, -4%. In talking to taproom operators, I think the biggest challenge, and I'd say the two biggest challenges I hear overall are driving traffic and rising costs. And taproom operators, driving traffic seems to be the one that they're most concerned about. This creates a tricky balance between investment and efficiency. When money's tight, how much do I invest? How much is too much in events, in marketing, in an effort to get those beer drinkers off the couch and into your tap room? In his book, Unreasonable Hospitality, Will Guidara says, luxury means just giving more. Hospitality means being more thoughtful. My sense is that the taproom operators who are being most successful in figuring out this balance are the ones that are doing it thoughtfully through the lens of their communities. They're thinking about what their community needs, what's going to get them off the couch, and then they're creating those community gathering spaces and investing in ways that are relevant. Brewpubs slightly outperformed taprooms at -3%. This matches earlier data and analysis that we presented to BA members, showing that the locations, using point-of-sale data, the locations with the better performance in the last year had a higher percentage of food sales. I think this makes sense. As with tap rooms, it's hard to get people off their couch and onto your bar stools, and food service gives you another tool in order to do that. Some of this is our own fault as an industry, especially post-COVID, when so many of you are now packaging. I can get a world-class version of just about any style in a can or a bottle and drink it at home. One thing I can't do is replicate my local brewpub's fish fry or Detroit-style pizza, though I do make a mean pizza, but it's not as good as my local brewpubs. So just like tap rooms, brewpubs are going to have this challenge of how much do I invest in these things to get people off the couch, but keep my costs reasonable in a world of rising costs. Certainly having that advantage of food service doesn't ensure profitability in a world where everything costs more. Brewpubs have the additional challenge of food service in the kitchen, and so what I will say is I'm in awe of those of you who are still signing up to open new brewpubs. Godspeed. If we wipe away business models, there are also variations by brewery size. For all categories above 500 barrels, depending on how you slice it, you can slice it different ways, you fall somewhere of declines between 2 and 4%. Well, if we're at 4%, if you're doing the math in your head, that means less than 500 barrels did not do that well. And in fact, less than 500 barrels was about the worst performing slice we could find at -9.5%. Given that this represents 64% of all breweries, not necessarily 64% of all volume, but 64% of all breweries, I think that really helps paint the picture of why there were so many stories of hardship in 2024. The small brewery around the corner was really the one that suffered most. Some of this was due to the same distribution challenges and SKU rationalization that microbreweries face, but obviously these breweries, less than 500 barrels, are much less distribution focused, so this was also driven by a drop in on-site sales. Given the tougher trends in both channels, distribution and on-site, my sense is some of this is related to scale, resources, and the ability to invest, such as pricing, marketing, and sales staff. My message to that group would be you still need to invest if you're going to be here long term, though I recognize that's a challenging balance. Relatedly, many headlines were made this year of the first year in a while where we saw closings outpace openings. It feels like a world different from the 2010s when we were growing at 1,300 breweries opening a year, 4 breweries opening a day. But it comes just 20 years removed from the last year where we saw the number of breweries decline. That was 2005. In fact, from 2000 to 2005, we saw the number of breweries decline 1% every year. So while this feels very unique in recent memory, it's not unprecedented in wider context. And it's also, I would continue to point out, fairly low in comparative terms. Hospitality businesses tend to average 8 to 10% closings every year, so we're still beating the odds in broader context. One other thing to note is that that closing rate hasn't really ticked up that much. Obviously, it's going up a little bit, I think driven heavily by that less than 500 barrel group. But what's really driven this flip is the decline in openings, which we've seen pretty linearly year over year. All right. We're going to move to a little bit more optimistic close. So how do we get out of this pattern? I want to close with a few thoughts about where we are, where craft isn't perhaps connecting with the next generation, and some perspective on how we might flip the script. I'm going to start here with a positive. There's a lot of bemoaning Gen Z going on right now in the general industry. If there's going to be Gen Z and alcohol in a headline, it's probably going to be, oh, Gen Z isn't drinking, they only consume cannabis. In our industry, it's often, well, Gen Z isn't coming into craft quite as much as we would have hoped. But looking at the data, at least for craft, that's largely a fiction. Here's 4 generations, you can see, and this is an index of their craft consumption relative to their percentage in the population. 100 means you're consuming at the same percent we would expect in the population. Above that's higher, below that's lower. Gen Z isn't quite the millennials yet, but they're higher than any other category, more than Gen X, almost 140. Now, this is the percentage who drink, not how much they drink, not how often they drink. And our research suggests that the problem is that Gen Z aren't considering craft, but that they aren't drinking it at a high percentage of their occasions. So very similar to that overall equation we presented, there are plenty of them drinking craft, they're just not drinking it very often. Some of this is income-based. As my fellow economist Lester Jones likes to say, no dinero, no cerveza. If you don't have any money, it's hard to buy beer. And so as the Gen Z moves up in the working world, as they get better jobs, they're going to have a little more money, craft has a higher price point, maybe they'll buy a little bit more. But I don't think we should bank on that, given that we're seeing this similar occasion challenge across all generations, and even with millennials who have moved up that income ladder. So what gives? Well, it's dangerous to simplify these kind of large-scale generational shifts to bite-sized chunks. That's the job of a 30-minute talk. Our research continues to suggest that the number one reason people don't drink craft is they're drinking more of something else. And the number one reason that they're drinking more of something else is that they don't like or think they don't like the flavor. To me, this is an insight to grab onto and start thinking about how we can break out of that pattern. Craft's broad success over the past decade has been driven by 3 letters, I, P, and A. And that's been great for a lot of you. I'm sure a lot of you have built flagship brands around that. And I'm pretty sure whoever wins the gold medal Thursday in IPA is going to be thrilled. People who win it in Brown Porter, Classic Saison, I'm sure are also going to be thrilled. And all of you know that there's a lot of different styles out there, but I'm not sure consumers have gotten that message. We're going to do more research here, but I bet you if I quizzed 21-year-olds and asked them what they thought about craft beer, a high percentage of them would say, oh, it's all hoppy and bitter. How can we break out of that? You know, I know, the amazing range of flavors that we're all producing, even if we're just talking about within beer. How can we connect the next generation with the sour, the fruity, the tart, the juicy, all those amazing things? Maybe that's where they stop. Maybe that's all they're interested in, and maybe that's their gateway to brown ale and English mild and the glory of malt. But until we get them in that door, we're not going to get the opportunity to see them on that journey. I'm a firm believer that craft has the brands and the flavors that we need to win in the beverage alcohol environment today. It's an environment driven by flavor and variety. But what we need to get back to is focusing on delighting the customer, connecting with them, and what they're looking for. So in total, the long-term structural picture contains plenty of concerns, but there are bright spots as well. Regardless, my message to you all here would be, if you're just trying to ride out the short-term headwinds and make it to this long-term picture, you should probably reconsider that strategy. Again, what's your strategy? I'll close this talk with one more optimistic reminder, though, borrowed from a recent presentation by Burkhard Nessen of Rabobank that he gave to the wine industry. Many of those long-term challenges I laid out as structural, neo-temperance, interest in health and wellness, or an overall decline in beverage alcohol consumption have been called out by the media before. You can find almost identical headlines from the late 1980s and early 1990s talking about, as the New York Times called it at the time, a fundamental change in American culture around reduced drinking. It took another decade for those headlines to go away and the tide to turn, but by the early 2000s, we were set up for another 25 years of beverage alcohol growth, which brings us to where we are today. Yes, we have new challenges we didn't have back then. Hemp beverages were still a twinkle in someone's eye. But what is cyclical, what is structural, often depends on your view. And if you take a long-term view, beer has weathered many cycles. That may be cold comfort for the next quarter or for your next investor meeting, but hopefully is reassuring and a good reminder for anyone looking to build a generational business. For those of you that are looking to build that generational business, remember that the pioneering craft brewers, some of the people we saw in one of the earlier videos, some of the people you'll still see around the halls here today, weathered equally rough seas, and through a combination of innovation, smarts, and pure hard work, found their way out the other side. You've got this, and we've got your back. All right. Thank you. Thank you for your time, your membership, and for being here with us in Indianapolis. I hope it's an inspiring and valuable week. Thank you.